My family threw me a birthday dinner at a cheap diner. My brother raised his glass and smirked, 25 and still single? Pathetic. My mother clinked her fork against her plate and muttered, "You're a disgrace to this family." I laughed through tears, until the waitress handed me a note that turned my whole life upside down. 25 and still single? Pathetic, Seth said, raising his cheap glass of champagne. I forced a tight smile as my mother tapped her fork against her chipped plate and muttered under her breath, "You're a disgrace to this family." I let out a weak laugh, blinking away the sting in my eyes, just as the waitress slipped a folded napkin onto the table in front of me, pretending it was part of the service. When I opened it, my world shifted in a way I couldn't have expected. The Maple Street diner wasn't much to look at. The sign outside buzzed and flickered with broken neon letters, and the interior smelled like burnt coffee and fryer oil that had soaked into the walls years ago. It was the kind of place you ended up when you had no imagination, or, in my family's case, no real regard for appearances when it came to celebrating someone you barely liked. When Patricia, my mother, had called and said she wanted to do something special for my birthday, I almost didn't believe her. We weren't the warm and fuzzy type of family. Growing up, affection was a currency tightly held, handed out only when it served a purpose. Seth, my older brother, had been the golden child for as long as I could remember. Charming, loud, full of jokes, the kind that cut deep if you listened closely enough. And me? I was the quiet one. The one who got good grades, stayed out of trouble, but somehow still managed to be a disappointment. When I arrived at the diner, they were already seated, Seth sprawled out like he owned the place, Patricia upright and rigid like she was judging every sticky surface. I slid into the booth, already wishing I hadn't come. Seth wasted no time before he launched into his favorite sport, publicly tearing me down. He made digs about my job, office admin at a small insurance firm. My apartment, a one-bedroom walk-up that, according to him, smelled like sadness. And, of course, the fact that I was single. I tried to laugh it off. I always did. It was easier than the alternative, letting them see they could still hurt me. When the waitress came by to refill our water glasses, she leaned a little too close to me and slipped the napkin onto the table with practiced casualness. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But something about the stiffness in her shoulders made me look closer. "Meet me behind the diner. It's about your father." The words were hurried, shaky. I felt the blood drain from my face. For most of my life, Royce, my father, had been a ghost story. The man who left without looking back. The reason for my mother's bitterness, the cautionary tale Seth used when he talked about how women had to choose wisely or end up alone and bitter like Camille. I told myself the note was a mistake. A prank, maybe. Still, my hand shook as I tucked the napkin into my jacket and muttered something about needing air. The back alley was everything you'd expect, dumpsters overflowing, puddles of grease rainwater, the dull hum of a flickering street light. I almost turned around. Almost told myself it was nothing. But then a figure stepped from the shadows. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair grayer, face lined with deep creases that hadn't been there in the blurry childhood memories I clung to. But the eyes, sharp, blue, weary, were the same. "Camille," he said, voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in days. I froze. "Dad?" He nodded, a sad smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. I didn't know whether to run to him or run away. I stayed rooted to the spot, every nerve ending screaming. "I don't have much time," he said, glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to come tearing after him. "They lied to you. Your mother and Seth, they lied about everything." The world seemed to narrow down to just his words, the cold air, and the weight of years pressing against my chest. He told me that Patricia hadn't been some abandoned wife scraping by with 2 kids. No, she had orchestrated his disappearance. She had been seeing someone else, a man with money and influence. She wanted Royce gone, permanently. When he resisted, she played dirty, faked evidence, manipulated court officials she knew through her side piece, and blackened his name so completely that when he left, no one questioned it. No one, least of all me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch something. Instead, I listened as he explained that it wasn't just ancient history. Patricia and Seth were planning something else now, selling the house, the only real family asset, and putting everything in Seth's name. Cutting me out without a second thought. "You have to come with me," Royce said, pulling out a battered envelope. "I can prove everything. But we have to go now." I looked back at the diner, the cracked windows, the blurry outline of my family, laughing like they hadn't just gutted me moments before. Something broke loose inside me. I turned back to Royce. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." We drove for hours, Royce's truck rattling along backroads until we ended up at a faded motel 2 towns over. Inside the room, under the sickly yellow light, he laid everything out on the bedspread: court documents, emails, bank records, notarized statements from people I'd never heard of but who had sworn under oath that my mother had lied. It wasn't just family betrayal. It was criminal. Patricia had embezzled money from Royce's family business, the one she told me had gone under because of my father's incompetence. She had hidden assets, lied about custody proceedings, and spread rumors that Royce was dangerous, unstable. My hands shook as I flipped through the evidence. 20 years of lies. 20 years of thinking I wasn't good enough because half of me came from a man who supposedly didn't want me. I didn't know how long I sat there, going through page after page, before Royce spoke again. "You can still walk away from this," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything." But I knew that wasn't true. I didn't owe Patricia or Seth my silence anymore. They had taken enough from me. Now, it was my turn. I didn't sleep that night. Royce dozed off in the uncomfortable chair by the window, but I sat on the edge of the motel bed, flipping through documents until my eyes burned. The truth was there in black and white, staring back at me. At some point, as the sun started bleeding into the sky, I made up my mind. I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to make sure Patricia and Seth felt everything they had made me feel for years: powerless, blindsided, small. But I wasn't going to be reckless. I had to be smart. Careful. Methodical. The first step was finding someone I could trust. Royce handed me a card, an old, worn business card for a woman named Bernice O'Hara. "She's a lawyer," he said. "Helped me with everything. If anyone can help you, it's her." I met Bernice at a small, no-frills law office wedged between a laundromat and a closed-down video rental store. She was nothing like the lawyers you saw on TV, no flashy suits, no fake smiles. She wore jeans and a cardigan, her silver hair twisted into a loose knot, and when she spoke, it was with a calm, almost ruthless certainty that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy for wanting justice. We spent hours going through everything. Bernice laid out the situation bluntly: Patricia's hidden assets, the fraudulent paperwork, the will that had been quietly adjusted without my knowledge, all of it pointed to something I could challenge. Legally and publicly. But it wouldn't be easy. People in town still believed Patricia's version of things. Seth was well-connected, charming enough to have most people eating out of his hand. "You need to be strategic," Bernice said, steepling her fingers under her chin. "You have the evidence. But you can't just throw it all at them. They'll find a way to spin it, make you look vindictive. You need to hit where it hurts, quietly, precisely." I didn't have to think long about what that meant. Patricia loved her reputation. In her mind, she wasn't just some bitter woman scraping by, she was a survivor. A pillar of the community. She chaired fundraisers, organized bake sales, sat in the front pew every Sunday pretending she was holier than anyone else. If her skeletons came spilling out of the closet, she wouldn't just lose money. She'd lose everything that mattered to her. I moved carefully. I went back to Scranton, pretending nothing had changed. I answered Patricia's passive-aggressive texts with polite, empty responses. I smiled tightly through Seth's smug, knowing looks when he mentioned upcoming changes in the family. I waited. Meanwhile, Bernice helped me file a formal petition with the court to contest the house sale. based on evidence that Patricia was acting fraudulently to exclude me from my rightful share. Quietly, we also filed a report about the hidden assets and financial fraud. The DA's office opened an inquiry, discreet at first, but enough to make the walls start to crack. The first sign came when Patricia called me one evening, her voice tighter than usual. "I heard a rumor," she said without preamble. "Someone's been snooping into my business affairs. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Camille?" I leaned against the counter in my tiny apartment, staring at the peeling paint on the cabinets. "No, Mom," I said sweetly. "Why would I care about your business?" A pause, heavy with suspicion. "You're not as clever as you think you are," she hissed finally. I smiled. "Maybe not," I said. "But I don't need to be." I hung up before she could say anything else. The second sign was Seth. I ran into him at the grocery store, purely by accident. He blocked my cart in the cereal aisle, leaning in close enough that I could smell the cheap cologne he always drowned himself in. "You think you're going to win?" he said, voice low and mean. "You're nothing. You've always been nothing." I met his eyes, calm and steady. "Funny," I said. "If I'm nothing, why are you so scared?" He flinched, barely, but I saw it. I pushed my cart past him without another word. Things escalated after that. Patricia started calling more often, leaving long, rambling voicemails about family loyalty and forgiveness. Seth sent texts that veered between taunts and desperate pleas. I ignored them all. Instead, Bernice and I pressed forward. The DA's office found evidence of not just financial fraud, but also perjury, lying under oath during the original custody battle with Royce. It opened a deeper investigation. News started trickling through the small-town gossip mill. People whispered. The same people who had always looked down on me with pity in their eyes were now looking at Patricia with something closer to disgust. The cracks were becoming fractures. One night, not long after all this started gaining speed, I found myself parked outside the old family house. It was a modest two-story place, paint peeling on the shutters, the front porch sagging slightly from years of neglect. I remembered sitting there as a kid, swinging my legs off the edge, dreaming of the day I could leave. The lights were on inside. I could see shadows moving, Patricia pacing, Seth slouched on the couch. It should have felt satisfying, seeing them unravel. Instead, it just felt sad. All my life, I had wanted something from them. Approval. Love. Something. But standing there, watching them tear each other apart from a distance, I realized the truth. I didn't need anything from them anymore. They couldn't hurt me unless I let them. And I was done letting them. I sat there in the car for a long while, engine off, just breathing. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe some last surge of anger. Maybe sadness. But mostly, I just felt hollow. Like I had outgrown something I'd spent my whole life trapped inside. The next morning, Bernice called. "The financial audit on the house sale came back," she said. I could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background. "Patricia's been moving assets through Seth's accounts for years." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "She's cooked," Bernice added, voice dry. "And Seth's right there with her." It wasn't just the house anymore. It was decades of financial manipulation, trust funds meant for me siphoned away, joint accounts that Royce had originally contributed to that were emptied without permission. It was enough to file a civil lawsuit, and maybe even trigger criminal charges if the DA decided to move forward. Bernice was careful, though. "Move fast, but don't be flashy," she said. "Let them think they're still in control." That was the key. Patricia had spent her whole life believing she was smarter than everyone else. If she smelled blood too early, she would fight harder. If I wanted real justice, I had to let her feel safe just long enough to lose everything. I kept playing the dutiful daughter. I answered her calls when she reached out. I let her complain about the stress of trying to sell the house, about how selfish Seth had been lately, and how ungrateful I was for questioning her decisions. I listened. I smiled. I lied through my teeth. In the meantime, Bernice helped me quietly file an injunction that froze the sale of the house pending investigation. Patricia wouldn't know until the buyers pulled out, embarrassed and furious, leaving her holding a property she had already borrowed heavily against. The news hit her 2 days later. I got the voicemail at work, sitting in my cramped cubicle surrounded by stacks of insurance paperwork. She was shrieking, actually shrieking, about how someone was sabotaging the deal, how everything was falling apart, how she knew I was behind it even if she couldn't prove it. I saved the message. Bernice said it might come in handy later. Seth, for his part, seemed to unravel even faster. I heard through town gossip that he had been passed over for a big promotion at his job. Word about the investigation had gotten around quietly, enough to make the company think twice about attaching themselves to the family drama. He started showing up drunk at the old bars we used to avoid growing up, the kind of places where people nursed their bitterness over cheap whiskey and bad jukebox music. Every time I heard another rumor about Seth making a scene, or about Patricia being politely uninvited from yet another charity committee, I felt a tiny, cold satisfaction bloom in my chest. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because, for the first time, I was writing my own story, and they couldn't control it anymore. One evening, about a week after the deal fell through, I got a text from Patricia. "Come over. We need to talk." I stared at the screen, debating. It was probably a trap. Some last-ditch attempt to guilt me, or scream at me, or both. But a part of me wanted to see it. The cracks up close. I texted back a simple, "On my way." When I pulled up to the house, it looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was even more chipped. The porch sagged worse than before. The place had an abandoned, defeated feel to it, like the rot that had always been hidden under the surface was finally showing. Patricia answered the door almost immediately, like she'd been waiting just behind it. She looked older. Tired. Not the cold, sharp woman I had grown up fearing, but just a bitter, aging woman clinging to something that was already slipping through her fingers. Seth was inside too, slouched in the armchair, arms crossed, mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. The living room was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere. An open bottle of wine on the coffee table. The smell of stale air and resentment. Patricia didn't waste time. "What do you want?" she snapped. I blinked at her. "You asked me to come." "We know what you're doing," Seth slurred from his seat. "You think you're gonna take everything from us? You're nothing without us." I let out a slow breath, keeping my voice even. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "I just want what's rightfully mine." Patricia laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You're ungrateful," she said. "After everything we gave you." "Everything you gave me?" I repeated, the words tasting sour. "You mean the lies? The humiliation?" Her mouth tightened, but she didn't deny it. "You would have been nothing without me," she said instead. "No one else would have put up with you." It was meant to hurt. Maybe once, it would have. But standing there, looking around at the crumbling house and the people who had built their lives on top of my broken self-esteem, I realized something. I didn't owe them my pain anymore. I didn't owe them anything. I turned to leave. "Where do you think you're going?" Patricia snapped. "Home," I said simply. Their voices followed me down the driveway, shrill and desperate. I didn't look back. After I left the house that night, I knew there was no going back. Not even the tiniest thread tying me to them was left. The next morning, Bernice filed the final suit. We weren't just freezing the sale of the house anymore. We were officially suing Patricia and Seth for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, misappropriation of trust assets, and a handful of other charges that stacked up like bricks. The DA's office had gathered enough evidence to quietly start building their criminal case too, but they moved slowly, carefully, making sure every piece was locked tight before moving forward. I didn't need them to rot in jail. I just needed the truth out. I needed them stripped of everything they valued, their money, their reputation, their control. The fallout began a week later. First, the bank called in their debts. Patricia had borrowed against the house's expected sale, assuming she would pocket the money clean and clear. Now that the sale had collapsed and the asset was under litigation, they demanded immediate repayment. She didn't have it. Within a few days, foreclosure notices started arriving. Neighbors noticed. People talked. Then Seth's employer officially terminated him. The ongoing fraud investigation, though still quiet, had been enough to scare them into distancing themselves from the family wrongdoing. He didn't take it well. I heard through the grapevine that he had been evicted from his fancy downtown apartment and had to move back into Patricia's crumbling house. The two of them, trapped together, drowning in the wreckage they built. The final court hearing was scheduled 6 weeks later. Patricia tried everything to delay it, filing counter motions, claiming illness, even trying to argue that I was mentally unfit to challenge the estate. Each attempt was shot down. Bernice had made sure the paperwork was airtight. The day of the hearing, I wore my best navy blue blazer, simple, clean, professional. I wasn't there to shout or gloat. I was there to finish this. Patricia looked like a ghost of the woman I remembered. Pale, haggard, clutching a cheap handbag like it was a life preserver. Seth sat next to her, twitching his leg, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. They barely looked at me. When the judge read the decision, it felt surreal. The court recognized that Patricia and Seth had engaged in fraudulent conduct to deprive me of my rightful inheritance and trust assets. The house was ordered to be sold under court supervision, with proceeds divided fairly. Patricia was fined heavily. Seth's involvement was noted and forwarded to the state bar for ethical review, effectively destroying any future he might have had in professional fields. The criminal side of things would be separate, but the damage was already done. They would never recover from this. After the hearing, Patricia approached me outside the courthouse. For a second, she looked almost small. "Are you happy now?" she said, her voice cracking. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had spent my entire life tearing me down, shaping me into something fragile and fearful just to make herself feel powerful. And now? She was just a bitter, broken woman with nothing left to cling to. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. Not the burning, gloating triumph. Just peace. "I'm free now," I said simply. "And that's enough." I turned and walked away, my heels clicking steadily against the sidewalk, leaving Patricia and Seth standing there, alone with their failures. They had lost everything. And I had gained something they could never take from me again, myself. The settlement money wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to start fresh. Enough to build something real, something that belonged only to me. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, a place I had dreamed about during late nights stuck under Patricia's roof, pretending I didn't hear her whispered insults through my bedroom door. I found a little apartment with a sunlit balcony, filled it with second-hand furniture and books. I started writing again, something I hadn't allowed myself to do since I was a teenager. I built a quiet, steady life. One filled with small joys, morning coffee on the balcony, long walks through downtown streets, nights spent reading by lamplight. Sometimes, memories of Patricia and Seth creep in, sharp and uninvited. Sometimes I think about the version of myself that might have stayed, might have kept trying to earn love from people who had none to give. But then I remind myself, I chose freedom. I chose the truth. I chose me. And that's the best revenge there is.